Thank you so much for joining us, the Project Censored Radio Show. This segment is a bit different than the typical interview setup. Today, we're going to be talking about what I've named queer journeys, not least of all the bi and or pansexual journey is one of the ones that is often censored and shown as confused, reckless, slutty, etc. And since this is Project Censored, in the interest of bringing forward the lived experiences that are not in the Lockheed Martin funded pride parades and news coverage, I'm very glad to be joined once again on the show by my dear friend and partner in biness, Jen Deerinwater, who is a bisexual, two-spirit, multiply disabled citizen of the Cherokee Nation of Oklahoma, and an award-winning journalist and organizer who covers the myriad of issues her communities face with an intersectional lens. Jen is the founding executive director of Crushing Colonialism and a 2019 New Economies Reporting Project and 2020 Disabilities Futures Fellow. Jen is a regular contributor to Truth Out, and her work has been featured in a wide range of publications as well as anthologies. Jen has been interviewed for numerous outlets and her work and The Advocate named Jen a 2019 Champion of Pride. Jen is also a 2022 member of the Susan M. Daniels Disability Mentoring Hall of Fame. And while raised in rural areas of her nation's reservation in Oklahoma and in rural Texas, and a nomad at heart, Jen currently lives on occupied Piscataway land known as Washington, D.C. Jen, thanks so much for joining us.
Yeah, thank you for having me here.
So, again, this is a bit of a different, it's basically like inviting people to have, to creep on a conversation that you and I are having. But I thought about when we were at Baltimore Pride together, and I thought, this is really something that should be discussed because it is very censored, this bi in particular, this bi journey. And I know we're outside of Pride Month, but I've always colored outside the lines anyway. So I wanted to start off just asking and talking about that initial time. I don't want to say moment because that's too much like, oh, that was July 2nd, where you started to have questions about this heteronormative structure that you were brought up in.
Oh, that's a question. That's a question. I would say when I was a child, honestly, is when I started questioning it. Long before I ever had even the slightest inkling that I could be queer. I saw a lot of, not all of my family, but I saw some very gendered roles around who does what in the household. I come from a family where the women had to work outside of the home. It wasn't financially possible for women to just be, quote, stay-at-home moms and wives. But at the end of the day, when they'd come home, they were still expected to cook and clean and do all the childcare. And so there were a lot of things I saw growing up that I didn't understand. And it didn't make sense to me. I was like, why would I want to take part in this? From what I'm seeing, the women in my family are run ragged, while the men just have one job, So there were a lot of things there that I already was just like, no, thanks. I don't want any part of this. Like, I decided when I was quite young that I didn't want to get married and I didn't want to have children. And I'm 44 and I'm still very thankful every second of every day that I am single and child free.
And when you were growing up, was the concept of bisexuality or was the concept of two-spirit something that you were introduced to?
No, not at all. Kind of like in our conversation at Pride recently, I did not knowingly, like I didn't know an open queer person until I was 21 when I had left home and was living in Los Angeles. There was some talk about someone I worked with in high school who was supposedly bi and, but that was kind of it. Like, there was no recognition whatsoever of queerness outside of just the Christians that I grew up around saying how horrible queer people were. So, I thought the feelings that I had for women when I was younger, honestly, I thought they were just because men were such sexist and, abusive people. wasn't until I got older and realized, oh no, wait, I'm bi. I just intensely dislike men as human beings, but I'm actually attracted to all the genders. So yeah, that's what's going on.
Yeah, I mean, I remember because my mom's an artist, and I remember I would look through her art books very often, and there are, of course, a lot of nude women in art books. And I just thought that because my mom would point out, oh, art, isn't this beautiful art? I was like, oh, so every woman thinks that other naked women are really beautiful and also attractive in that kind of way, and that's just a thing. And so I guess that makes me straight, right? And it wasn't until I was older that I was like, oh, you guys don't feel the same way? Oh, that's weird. Like, and I was also, I mean, I didn't grow up in Oklahoma or Texas, but I grew up in North Carolina, which is also very, very, very narrow in terms of, and the school that I went to was incredible. Like people threw food at me in the cafeteria just for saying no to the Iraq War. So the idea of being queer was absolutely not up for discussion. And I just remember trying to really be very outwardly straight. And then I'm not even sure like how you can do that, but I tried to be like no, I'm definitely straight because I played softball and everybody thought that the theater kids were gay. So I had like 2 strikes against me and people would call me dyke. And I was like, no, I'm straight. I just also think that women are attractive. Is this weird? This is normal, right? But like I had nobody to talk to about it because nobody else was openly queer. And then of course later on Facebook, like, a bunch of people that I went to school with are now openly queer, but we were all just kind of like, no, we're straight. We're super, super straight. Okay. Please don't throw food at me or beat me up after school. I mean, there was nowhere to discuss these thoughts and these feelings. And I imagine had there been any professors or any teachers, that they would have been fired if they even entertained the conversation with a student, asking them like if these feelings were normal.
Oh, absolutely. I can't imagine having asked anyone that I went to school with, student or faculty, for help. I mean, I struggled a great deal with suicidal ideation. I tried to kill myself several times as a kid. Like I already wasn't getting help and support as like a Native child and one who was chronically ill and suicidal. I can't imagine if I had realized I was queer as well. Like I almost kind of think that my subconscious maybe kind of like subverted it to keep me alive. I kind of wonder sometimes, as well as just, not having anyone to talk to and not having anyone to look to, even coming out as bi, it was, later in life, it was really difficult for me because there was still very much this attitude that I would sometimes get from people of, oh, well, you're just confused. You don't understand. You're really just straight. I'd get that a lot because I'm more feminine in my appearance. Or I would sometimes get, well, you're just really gay and you don't know it yet. Or, and I've gotten this one, including from a therapist, that I'm just bi because I'm a rape survivor. Because, that's how sexuality works. I lost it on that therapist. I was like 26, 27, I think, when that happened. And I said to her, I was like, first of all, if women became queer for being raped, every woman on this earth would be a lesbian. Let's be real. All of us would. And second, like, I know this is going to terrestrial radio, so I can't actually say what I told to her, but you can imagine it was colorful. So even as an adult, there's still, like, even now that I know who I am and I'm confident in that, there's still that nonsense. There's still people to this day acting like bisexuality isn't real, or they don't want to date me because of it. I remember all the jokes as well when I came out of, oh, you're bi, all your options have increased. And I'm like, actually, they decreased. Like, I don't have extra options. Just call me a bitter bisexual. I hate everybody.
Dude, it's so true that, well, the trope is like, oh, you're bi, so you're slutty. First of all, there's nothing wrong with enjoying sex. That's the first point. But secondly, no, I am like the most picky person that I know. So I've probably had sex with way less people than my straight and just gay friends have, because I'm so picky. Like, bi does not mean that you are just like, yeah, I'll have sex with anything. But this also was like a common trope with gay folks and back in the day, like, oh, well, they're what's next, having sex with donkeys. And the mental health issue is something that we see a lot with particularly trans kids, like, oh, it's because you were abused as a child, or it's because you have mental health issues, that's why you're trans, as opposed to this is really who that person is. And yeah, I mean, it's I guess it's not okay, but it's more predictable in the straight male community. For the, you know, when I've dated guys, they've been like, well, you're with me, so you must just be straight. But in the queer community, there were a lot of women that would say, well, you're with me, so you're just a lesbian, why can't you just accept it? Really just trying to blot out the B and LGBT. Like, well, that's not a thing. And I don't understand where this animosity comes from. And one woman I dated said, well, I just can't imagine, like, penis actually scares me, so the fact that you interact with that at all makes it creepy for me to interact with you. And I was like, okay, well, I understand having a lot of fear and trauma around male genitalia and maleness in general. But as a whole, like, what is it? Why is it still so prevalent? You know, even like a few years ago, I went into a lesbian bar and they were like, you know, one woman said, kind of jokingly, but kind of not, like, well, why are you here if you're bi? And I'm like, or why are we doing this? Why is there so, like, why are we infighting? Like, enough people hate us anyway. Like, why are we attacking each other?
Yeah. I just like, I really kind of pulled away from queer community years ago because of the biphobia, and then just the anti-native racism. And now as a disabled person, I can't even go to most queer bars or events because no one bothers to make anything disability accessible. So I, in general, am just like, I feel like I'm just a queer out here on an island by my own, you know, like I don't quite feel wanted and accepted by the queer community, but I'm sure as hell not accepted by the straight community.
Well, and I wanted to dig into some of those intersections as well. In terms of being two-spirit, was that a journey that happened in parallel, or was that something that came about because you did your own research after you had already embraced being bi?
So it came, yes. So all of the natives that I grew up around were pretty anti-queer. They either said things that were outright anti-queer, or they just made it very well known that queerness was uncomfortable and unacceptable. You had to behave in a certain way, or you weren't a real man, you weren't a real woman. I now recognize that that thought process is not in line with the traditional values of my tribe. It's not in line with many nations, but that is how some of our relatives are now as a result of colonialism. But the first time I heard the word two-spirit was when I was in college. I was an undergrad at USC, and I have many thoughts on that school. I will save them. But there was a professor who was a wretched human being, Walter Williams, was later arrested as for pedophilia. Yeah, lovely, lovely human being. And he's still considered to this day one of the lead researchers on two-spirit people. Horribly misogynistic, an abuser, and completely racist, and had no understanding of what two-spirit actually is. So everything I learned about two-spirits originally came from this really atrocious white man, this really awful white man who's done awful things to our communities and have stolen so much from us. And so that all of my concepts of indigeneity and queerness up until my 30s, like, that was kind of all I had, was either we hate queer people, or it's this one narrow interpretation by this racist, abusive white man. And then I started meeting more openly queer people. It was actually a lot of friends in Canada who were the ones who really started explaining to me, like, what gender looked like amongst different nations, where the term two-spirit came from, how it was applicable to me. And that was really it was a long journey of learning that I was two-spirit and realizing that, versus being bi. That just kind of came to me within a couple of months. It was like, oh, hey, I'm bi, but two-spirit was a longer journey. But that's also because being two-spirit, it's not just like a gender identity. It's a role within tribal community. It's a role within indigenous community. It's not the same as I just check a box. Like, this comes with roles and duties within my people that I am obliged to do. So I did not publicly come out as two-spirit until I was, I don't know, somewhere in my late 30s.
I think that also says a lot about traditional communities, indigenous communities versus colonialist communities, because checking a box, it's like, okay, well, I just check a box and I don't have any accountability to any community or any people. I'm just me, my individualist self, and that it's all about me and how I see myself. But to actually embrace a term, it was somebody at a pipeline protest that was explaining to me that you can't just call someone auntie in the indigenous community. Like, that is a role. And so that's not just something that you would say like, oh, this person's no, that is a lot of responsibility. Whereas of course, in the colonialist perspective, it's like, oh, that's just an aunt. That's just a thing that happened because your sibling had sex with someone else and had a kid. Like, that's just like, it's just, you don't, it's a very passive thing. And I wish that the queer community had more of a sense of that responsibility to each other, and which is really the grassroots of Pride anyway. These riots that demanded justice and human rights, but now it's just a corporatized bleep. But so I like with regards to those intersections too, I'm curious because in my history, being both Nordic and Jewish, I feel like most of the Nordic has gotten lost, because I do feel at some point in everybody's history there was an embrace of these queer identities, but it's been lost with the colonialism that happened in these nation states as they formed. When Sweden became a nation state. And by that, you have to dictate who belongs and who doesn't belong. And that's you can see that along the indigenous lines, but it also means along like gendered lines. So what was lost? And I know that a lot of people will point to like, oh, well, in Viking mythology, Thor dresses up as a woman and da da da. And it's like, but that wasn't considered a good thing. Viking society was very, very gendered. And that didn't mean that women didn't have power. Women had a lot of power as seers and as people who had power inside the home and on farms and things, but it was very, very gendered. And when it came to government, women were not part of it. And if they were, it was, the exception that proved the rule. So this trying to twist Viking mythology for a leftist perspective can be romantic, but there's absolutely nothing historically to show for that. And I am saddened to think of everything before that, in the hundreds and hundreds of years before, when that part of the world was settled by people. What was lost? Like, what kind of ideas about gender and what kind of acceptance and embracing of different identities was lost because of these more militant and gendered perspectives. But do you feel any connection to like your non-Indigenous background in terms of queerness, or?
Not really. I'll be honest, a lot of the European background I don't know as much about. That part of my family has just not been, they've just not been as interested in knowing those roots and where they come from. One of these days, if I can ever find some free time, I'm going to do a big family tree and learn about all of my ancestry. But I know there's a lot of German and some Swedish and Dutch in parts of my family, but in terms of queer identity or anything, like, I don't really identify with it a great deal. I look at whiteness and I think about some of the racism I saw within my family as a mixed native kid. Like, don't really want anything to do with it, to be honest. I every time I hear white people say like, well, I'm not racist, my grandchild is black, or my this is that, and I'm just like, I grew up with white family members who were like horribly racist. So what? Like, so I don't know. So no, I don't have any connection to like any queerness in that side of my family. But I mean, the white part of my family is pretty anti-queer as well. Like I'm sure they didn't think anything of it when they said things when I was a kid, but there's a reason I disconnected and have not spoken to my family. I think about some of the things they said, including things that were anti-queer. I don't want anything to do with them and all of that. Like, thanks, but no thanks.
Yeah, I can totally see that. When I was growing up, my parents were definitely not anti-queer. Both of my parents have queer friends, particularly my mom, because I don't know any artist who doesn't have a bunch of queer friends, because we're very artsy, aren't we? But it was never really talked about. And then of course, my brother became a big male model, and his agent was gay, and so I met a bunch more of queer folks through that, and that it was never discussed negatively. It wasn't just like wasn't discussed. It was kind of like, who cares? And so I kind of adopted that, but that also made me kind of quiet down my own questions because it wasn't even a thing. And I think that, like, especially with my brother being in that space, he was metrosexual. For people under the age of 30, you probably have no idea what that means, but that was like the term given to like the Backstreet Boy type thing, where you spend 4 hours getting those perfect little spikes on your hair, and you might put some foundation on, but you're super straight. That was my brother. And so I was like, oh, well, I guess I'm just straight and then also find women attractive. And then, as I've gotten older, I realized, well, all of this is just so muddied. I mean, even just me to this day grappling with bi and pan, like, I'm like, well, it's all just very fluid. Gender is fluid, and my preferences are fluid. And it just seems like, as I continue to learn more about these terms and these ideas, and I reflected on my own childhood, I continue to question, where do I fit in? And I'm curious, do you have that same feeling? Is pansexuality something that you use or are there other terms that you would use to describe yourself?
I think probably pansexual is more in line with who and what I am. Especially as like my own ideas have expanded over the years. I still just say that I'm bi because biphobia is real, it's a thing. Even though some folks like to act like it doesn't exist, it does. It's real. It's still around. I don't know. I feel like for me, it's more the individual than the gender. It's more the connection I have with someone. Like, you and I are both very sapiosexual. Like, we've had those conversations. And unlike you, though, when I was younger, I was a lot less selective in my partners. But as the years went on, I realized more and more, if I just don't have an intellectual connection with someone, I just don't have the level of attraction and the interest. And now at 44, I'm just kind of like, I've already been out there. I've already done everyone. It's about the individual. And if you're not right for me, then I'd just rather be at home with my cats, reading a book or watching TV. Like, I don't know. That's where I'm at.
Totally. Is there, in terms of the comparison between how we talk about it in an English speaking colonialist perspective, bi, pansexual, are there similar conversations in the Indigenous community and similar like research trying to dig up what's been I don't want to use the word lost, because it makes it sound like y'all just dropped it when you were on a walk or something, that's been destroyed. I hate when people are like, oh, the Palestinian people lost land. I'm like, dude, they didn't like loot. It wasn't that lost. No, I lost my keys. That was stolen violently. Like, so
Oh,
is there any
exactly.
is there any, kind of research into what was stolen and what was destroyed by colonialisms in terms of these identities?
Yeah, there's a growing amount of research being done. Of course, I can't think of the name of the author right now. I'm the worst at names. I'm the worst. Every time I get on an interview and people are like, oh, who should we follow? Whose book should we buy? I'm like, I don't know. I wasn't prepared for that. So there are people in the community. Some are academics, some are other types of storytellers, who are sort of bringing back some of that knowledge about, different gender identities and different ways of seeing sexuality, and gender within traditional indigenous ways. It's tough though, was because as people who are more oral storytellers, we don't have written documents to look to. So when your people are all being murdered and there are no documents, like, not that documents can't be destroyed and aren't all the time in acts of war, but it makes it harder. It makes it harder to know that knowledge that was lost. And the knowledge of our, multi-gendered people was purposefully oppressed. There are some records of the Spanish, for example, taking people that they did not consider to be, the right kind of men and doing awful things to them. There are records of Bureau of Indian Affairs officers requiring that men and women dress a certain way on the reservations they were forced onto. So there is some documentation out there about the suppression of our ways, but it is kind of hard. I've done a little bit of research, but a lot of it just comes down to, family history, stories shared amongst communities and elders. And so then it takes the time and the knowledge of finding the right people. And it's pretty resource intensive to do that kind of research.
Yeah, I imagine it is. And I was thinking while you were talking about kind of the modern iterations of something that we know existed, like for instance in Judaism, there's like the queer mikveh project. Mikveh is a ritual bath, and it's today very gendered. So like the women and the men are separated and they cannot do mikveh together. But if you don't identify and in that binary, then you are barred from partaking. So there's like the queer mikveh project that allows folks who identify as anything, as any gender, to partake. There's the Anarcho-Fagala collective, which I love. Fagala is like the Yiddish word for queer. Outlive them in New York City, and a lot of what they're doing is creating a new iteration of what we know as Jews existed, and a lot of times had to exist quietly, which is kind of ridiculous because Jews had to exist so quietly for so long anyway. It's like, could I just at least be myself as a Jew? But this is also part of that emulating the oppressor, which is of course what we see on a grand scale in the creation of Israel as a state. And I also was thinking about Braiding Sweetgrass, which is a phenomenally beautiful book. But in one of the chapters, she talks about how her father used to do a prayer when they were out camping. And I'm paraphrasing here, but she was saying that her father didn't know if this was actually the prayer that his ancestors used, to start the day. But he said that wasn't the point because the earth still understood him, and the earth understood his intent and his intention with that basically new prayer. Do you feel like there's something similar happening in Indigenous communities where, okay, well, that was destroyed. So how can we, as, the future of our ancestors, create something today that might not be exactly what existed, but it's the same feeling and it's the same vibe, and our ancestors will see and respect that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I see that in a lot of different spaces. The one that just most immediately comes to mind is the Two Spirit camp out at Ocheti Shikoi when the No Dapple camps were up, resisting the Dakota Access Pipeline, there were some people out there who did not welcome the Two Spirits. They didn't want us there. They didn't see us as leaders and warriors. But people like Candy Brings Plenty, for example, just kept at it and said, no, this is our place and we're here and we're going to fight for what's right. And, so you do see that there are spaces in which I see these sorts of things happening. There are some ceremonial spaces where they say, you know what, we're not going to make women go over here, men go over there. We're going to let you go in whichever ceremonial space feels right for you, but it's a lot of it comes down to more community. Are there any large nonprofits or projects or things like that? No, but also let's be real. Like, I think it's only like 0.2% of philanthropic dollars. Like, it's significantly less than even 1% of philanthropic dollars goes to Native causes. And then amongst those, very little of that goes to queer natives. So we don't have those sorts of like formal structures and things in place a lot of times for a host of reasons. But people are out here doing things. They're trying to decolonize. They're trying to take back things and make it more accessible to people, even very, very slowly, way too slowly in my opinion. But I am starting to see like the beginning kindling of like recognizing disability access. It's way too slow going, but there are some people up in Toronto who just made a power chair friendly sweat lodge. There are some people in Baltimore who were talking to me about like, how can we make us rebuild our sweat lodge to make it more accessible? So there are a lot of ways I see in Native community where people they are working, they are trying to make it more open to all of our relatives. But, we didn't get like this overnight, and we're certainly not going to unlearn over 500 years of colonialism overnight, and especially not when we are so purposefully under-resourced by foundations and governments.
Yeah, and I as you pointed out at the beginning, the kind of anti-queer sentiment that you experienced within the Indigenous community, I think that's something that that happens across the board. I know it absolutely happens inside Judaism. I mean, the present on the Passover table, there was the addition several years ago of an orange, which is not part of the traditional table, but it's a joke because I can't remember his name, but who cares, because he's said that the prominence of queer people in Judaism is as likely as having an orange on the Seder plate. And so now we have an orange on our Seder plate as a, as a middle finger to this guy, because obviously there are queer Jews, and you can see it particularly in Jewish mysticism, which I'm more into than the kind of classic Torah teachings. But like the Sefer Yetzirah, for instance, which is Jewish mysticism, talks about wisdom as a feminine entity, but not an embodied femininity. It's a femininity that exists outside of body, that's like a web of existence, a network. And there's a lot of this where it's like genders are not embodied and things are very fluid, just like the waters and the air. And there's a lot of that kind of talk. But of course, I remember at the temple that I grew up with in Charlotte, in North Carolina, my dad was telling me, oh, well, somebody suggested that we bring in the Sefer Yetzirah, and it was completely quashed by the board at the temple because of these kind of teachings and these concepts, I'm sure. And also just this idea that we are divine as connected to the creator and things like that. That's dangerous talk, but yeah, so the quashing of teachings that exist in our own communities is something that I think happens across the board, and is so for me, it's incredibly gut-wrenching to see, because I'm like,
yeah. I mean, you're already so alienated by the oppressor, and then to have your own people be the oppressor, your own family, your own friends, your religious, spiritual community, ceremonial community, whatever you want to call it. Like, it's it's like you've already punched me in the gut, and now you're just, I don't even know how to describe it. It's like you're just stabbing me repeatedly and twisting the knife, and oh, isn't it funny? Like I don't even know like how to explain to people how unloved I often feel, even within my own communities, how forgotten, how thrown away. And that is so painful for me. Like, it's more painful for me when a lesbian or a gay man says something biphobic than a straight person. It's more painful for me when a Native person says something anti-queer or ableist, or the disability community does something that's anti-Native, so on. Like, it's just another way of telling me over and over and over again that my life has no value. Unless, of course, it's for the free labor that I can hand over to movement, and then my life has tons of value, which is a whole other conversation I can have about, so-called liberals and even some of our radical leftists. This idea that we can just check a box and use someone up, and hey, that means we're pro-queer or we're pro this or whatever, when in fact you're actually just extracting labor out of us. You're taking our trauma and our talents and our time and just exploiting it. It's no different than, going to a job at, say, Starbucks or an office building or something. It's still exploitation,
Yeah, absolutely. I've oftentimes felt that people talk about, oh, well, a seat at the table. We want to make sure that these people have a seat at the table. And I'm like, but what's happening at the table? Because if the seat at the table is just so you can say, look, Indigenous person, or look, disabled person, or queer like, then screw your table. I'm flipping it over. Like, I don't want your table. Like, what the seat at the table, it's another one of those vapid liberal ideas where it's like, it sounds really nice, but it means nothing if I'm not part of the conversation, if I'm just there as some kind of like, figurehead.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. You're just the window dressing.
Yeah.
You're the weird cousin that we have to invite to the meal, but no one really wants them there.
Right. But we have to get the diversity dollars. So kind of wrapping up here. I mean, I know that there's so much that that needs to be done and needs to be discussed in terms of biphobia and bringing bi experiences to the fore. But what would you say to somebody, or I would hesitate to say your younger self, because I don't know that I want to talk to my younger self, but we have way too much to discuss, and I don't. But like, what would you say to somebody who might be thinking, well, am I bi, or is that a thing? Or because I feel like maybe it's not, and maybe I'm just confused. Like, what do you wish that maybe somebody who had the wisdom that you do now had said to you when you were in your 20s?
No. So many things I wish somebody had said to me in my 20s. You can do better.
Yeah.
That person's not good enough. Move it along. Yeah, bisexuality is real. Don't listen to what anyone else says. It's real. If you think you may be bi, then you might be bi. Don't let people pressure you in to, picking straight or gay, because that just feels like what everybody wants you to do, you know. And I know it's easier said than done to say, oh, be out and be proud, when we live in a world where it's so incredibly dangerous, especially right now with the direction that this trash bag of a country is going. But just know that, one, bisexuals actually make up the majority of the queer community. We are the majority, regardless of what some people might say. We're the bulk, number one. And number two, like, yeah, it's real. It's valid. We're here. And, all of the stereotypes and that people may say about us, like, it's all just rooted in anti-queerness. It's all rooted in heteronormativity. It's rooted in other forms of isms and oppressions. And just like, don't buy into it. Don't believe the hype.
Yeah, absolutely. And I would definitely say that, because this is, again, something that I heard a lot, regardless of whether you have a partner or regardless of the gender of your current partner, you are still bi.
Yes.
It is not a switch. I am currently living with a man and I have a child with that man. I'm still bi. I did not hand in my bi card when I decided that we would live together. Like it doesn't matter.
Mm-hmm. Yes, exactly. Exactly.
Well, I feel like we could have this conversation for the next 4 hours, but is there any last little thoughts for this time that you'd like to add that I might not have addressed?
No, nothing at the moment comes to mind.
Okay. Well, folks, thanks so much for joining us for Queer Journeys. Maybe we'll do this again sometime if it's something that people enjoy. But if not, I definitely recommend that folks check out Jen's work. Jen, what are the best websites or Twitter or Instagram or what have yous to look at for that?
So jdeerinwater.com is my website, or crushingcolonialism.org. You can find Jen Deerinwater and Crushing Colonialism on all of the social media platforms.
Okay, awesome. Thank you so much, Jen.
Awesome.